In the mid-14th century, a shadow fell across Europe that no army could fight and no kingdom could stop. Cities fell silent. Church bells rang endlessly for the dead. Families locked themselves inside their homes, terrified of an invisible enemy spreading from street to street. This was the Black Death, one of the deadliest disasters in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it would wipe out nearly half of Europe's population. But what was life actually like for the people who lived through it? Tonight, we step inside the streets, homes, and fears of a world collapsing under the weight of a mysterious and unstoppable plague. When the first whispers of a deadly illness began spreading through Europe in 1347, few people understood the catastrophe that was about to unfold. The disease, later known as the Black Death, likely traveled along trade routes from Asia, moving with merchants, ships, and caravans that connected distant parts of the medieval world. By the time it reached European ports, the infection was already unstoppable. One of the first major entry points was the bustling Mediterranean port city of Messina. According to historical accounts, ships arrived carrying sailors who were already gravely ill. Their bodies were covered with strange, painful swellings, dark lumps that appeared on the neck, groin, and armpits. Many died within days. Panic spread quickly. The city attempted to drive the ships away, but it was already too late. Within weeks, the sickness had begun spreading through the population. From there, the plague moved rapidly across Europe. Trade routes, crowded towns, and traveling merchants helped carry the disease into nearly every major region. Cities such as Florence, Paris, and London soon found themselves facing the same terrifying reality. People were dying faster than anyone had ever seen. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims often developed high fevers and severe weakness. Within days, swollen black lumps, called buboes, appeared across their bodies. In many cases, dark patches formed on the skin as tissues began to die. For medieval people, who had little knowledge of bacteria or infection, the plague felt like a supernatural punishment. Doctors were powerless. Medicine in the 14th century relied heavily on ancient theories about balancing the body's humors. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal remedies, and burning incense to cleanse the air. None of it worked. Soon, fear began to shape everyday life. Neighbors avoided one another. Families sometimes abandoned sick relatives to protect themselves. In crowded medieval cities, where people lived close together and sanitation was poor, the disease spread with terrifying speed. Church bells rang constantly as funerals filled the streets. Gravediggers struggled to keep up with the rising number of bodies. Entire households could vanish within days. And as the plague continued its relentless march across Europe, people realized something even more frightening. This was not a temporary outbreak. It was a disaster that would change the course of history forever. As the plague spread across Europe, daily life began to collapse in ways people had never imagined. Markets grew quieter, streets emptied, and the normal rhythm of medieval cities slowly disappeared. Fear ruled every decision. People avoided crowded places, shut their doors to neighbors, and watched helplessly as the sickness crept closer to their homes. In cities like Florence and London, entire neighborhoods began to fall silent. Families would go to bed together, and by morning half of them would be dead. Sometimes no one remained alive to even report what had happened. Houses were abandoned with food still on the tables and doors left swinging open. The disease struck with terrifying speed. Victims could appear healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. This rapid spread made the Black Death feel unstoppable. Many people believed the end of the world had arrived. Doctors were desperate. Without understanding germs or bacteria, they relied on strange and often ineffective treatments. Physicians wore long robes and masks filled with herbs, believing that sweet smells could block the deadly air they thought carried disease. These eerie figures moved through infected streets like ghosts, attempting to treat patients they could rarely save. Meanwhile, the death toll continued to climb. Churches struggled to keep up with the endless funerals. Priests who comforted the sick often caught the disease themselves. In some towns, so many clergy died that there was no one left to perform last rites. The spiritual crisis was just as severe as the physical one. Graveyards quickly filled beyond capacity. Soon, mass graves had to be dug outside city walls. Carts rolled through the streets collecting bodies, sometimes piled several high. The dead were wrapped quickly in cloth or blankets and buried together without ceremony. For survivors, the psychological toll was devastating. Every cough or fever triggered terror. Parents feared for their children. Friends stopped visiting one another. Communities that once relied on cooperation and trust became fractured by suspicion and fear. Many wealthy families fled the cities entirely, escaping to rural estates where they hoped the disease would not follow. In fact, the famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio described groups of young nobles retreating to countryside villas to wait out the plague while telling stories to pass the time. His famous book, The Decameron, gives one of the most vivid descriptions of life during the disaster. But most people were not wealthy enough to escape. Peasants, laborers, and city workers remained trapped in crowded towns where the disease spread rapidly. Some villages lost so many residents that entire communities disappeared from the map. Fields went unharvested. Shops closed. Trade slowed dramatically. For the first time in centuries, the medieval economic system itself began to crack under the pressure of mass death. Yet despite the chaos and fear, people continued searching for answers. Some believed the plague was punishment from God. Others blamed poisoned wells, foreigners, or mysterious celestial events. Rumors spread as quickly as the disease itself. But the truth was far simpler, and far more terrifying. The world had been struck by a pandemic unlike anything humanity had ever seen. And the worst was still to come. As the plague tightened its grip, society began to unravel in ways that were both horrifying and surreal. Fear mutated into panic, and panic often turned into cruelty. People sought explanations for the unstoppable death around them, and scapegoating became a common, tragic response. Entire communities of Jews, foreigners, or outsiders were accused of poisoning wells or invoking divine wrath, leading to mass persecution and executions. The terror was no longer only from disease. It came from neighbors, authorities, and the frenzy of collective paranoia. Cities became nightmarish landscapes. Streets were littered with unburied bodies, the smell of decay thick in the air. Survivors moved cautiously, avoiding contact with anyone, often assuming that every cough or shiver signaled imminent death. Families who stayed together often watched helplessly as one by one, loved ones succumbed. Entire households vanished overnight, leaving homes abandoned, food rotting, and livestock unattended. Amid this chaos, certain desperate groups sought salvation in extremes. Flagellants, penitents who whipped themselves publicly, marched through towns, believing that self-punishment could appease God and halt the plague. Their processions were both mesmerizing and terrifying, attracting crowds of the desperate while spreading disease further through physical contact. Their fervor revealed the depth of psychological strain people endured in the absence of real cures. Meanwhile, plague doctors became grim icons of the age. Dressed in long robes, gloves, and the infamous beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, they moved like ominous shadows through afflicted streets. Their treatments were rudimentary and often ineffective, but they represented one of humanity's earliest attempts at organized medical response. Watching them arrive was enough to instill both hope and dread, a reminder that disease could not be entirely understood, controlled, or avoided. The social fabric was shredded. Merchants fled, towns emptied, and trade slowed to a crawl. Markets, once bustling with life and noise, became ghostly avenues where fear dictated every transaction. Children were orphaned in droves, left to wander empty streets or be taken in by relatives who themselves were struggling to survive. The psychological trauma was as pervasive as the physical devastation. Despair became almost a universal condition. In rural areas, the plague was equally ruthless. Villages that once thrived saw farms abandoned, animals starving, and fields overgrown. Communities that had survived famine, war, and harsh winters were now disappearing under the weight of an invisible enemy. The death toll was staggering, leaving a population that would not fully recover for generations. Yet even in this darkness, glimmers of human resilience appeared. People sought comfort in small acts of care, burying the dead properly, tending to the sick, or supporting neighbors when possible. Stories of bravery, compassion, and ingenuity emerged amid widespread horror, reminding us that even in humanity's bleakest chapters, the instinct to survive and to help others remained strong. The Black Death did not just decimate populations, it reshaped society, religion, and culture. It forced Europe to confront mortality, faith, and the fragility of human systems. And while death was everywhere, the struggle to endure, adapt, and rebuild would ultimately lay the foundation for a transformed world. As the plague receded, Europe emerged into a world profoundly altered. The immediate horror of death gave way to a complex aftermath, one that reshaped society, economy, and culture in ways still felt centuries later. Survivors faced empty villages, ruined towns, and shattered families, confronting the immense task of rebuilding lives amid lingering fear and grief. Economically, the Black Death caused seismic shifts. With a massive portion of the workforce wiped out, labor became scarce, and wages for peasants and skilled workers rose dramatically. Feudal lords, once wielding near-absolute control over serfs and land, found their power challenged as workers demanded better conditions. In many regions, traditional hierarchies were disrupted. The scarcity of laborers empowered ordinary people in unprecedented ways, setting the stage for social mobility that had been previously unimaginable. The psychological scars ran deep. Entire generations had been traumatized by the sight of family members succumbing, by the pervasive smell of death, and by the constant threat that survival was precarious. Art and literature reflected this collective grief, with macabre imagery and motifs of mortality becoming central to cultural expression. Dance of death illustrations, plague-themed poetry, and cautionary tales emphasized the omnipresence of death while reinforcing moral and religious teachings, illustrating how society processed trauma through creativity. Religion, too, underwent transformation. The failure of clergy to prevent or adequately respond to the plague caused widespread disillusionment, while simultaneously fueling movements of piety, penitence, and mysticism. Flagellant processions had faded, but new forms of devotion and skepticism emerged. People questioned old doctrines, sought new interpretations of divine will, and increasingly turned to personal faith as institutional religion struggled to maintain authority. Urban life and trade slowly recovered, but the social contract had shifted. Communities now prioritized hygiene and public health in rudimentary ways, with early quarantines, isolation of the sick, and city ordinances aimed at disease prevention. The seeds of modern public health measures were being sown amid the devastation. Cities that had been depopulated gradually repopulate, but memories of the plague shaped urban planning, medical practice, and social norms for decades to come. Culturally, the Black Death left an enduring legacy. It instilled a heightened awareness of mortality, a focus on human fragility, and a recognition of the precariousness of life. People who survived gained new perspectives on wealth, power, and social relations, often pursuing opportunities that had previously been inaccessible. Literature, art, and folklore preserved the memory of the plague while embedding its lessons into collective consciousness, influencing generations that never directly experienced its horrors. Ultimately, Part 4 reveals that the aftermath of the Black Death was not merely survival but transformation. Society, though scarred, adapted and evolved, illustrating both the destructive power of disease and the resilience of human communities in the face of unimaginable loss. The final chapter of the Black Plague story is one of lasting impact. While death and devastation defined the immediate years, the long-term consequences reshaped Europe in profound ways. Survivors emerged into a world that was both fragile and full of opportunity, where social, economic, and cultural structures had been irreversibly altered. Population decline forced laborers to demand higher wages and better conditions, weakening the rigid feudal system and empowering common people. This shift laid the groundwork for social mobility, economic innovation, and even early movements toward personal freedom. Meanwhile, the psychological scars of mass death persisted, influencing art, literature, and religious expression for generations. Grim depictions of mortality, moral reflection, and cultural rituals of remembrance became central to European identity, reminding people of life's fragility and the unpredictability of fate. Religion was both challenged and reinforced. Many lost faith in institutions that seemed powerless to stop the plague, yet spirituality remained a source of comfort, leading to new practices, personal devotion, and moral reflection. Medicine and public health slowly advanced, driven by necessity and experience, as communities learned the importance of isolation, sanitation, and care for the sick, precursors to modern public health systems. The Black Plague also transformed human relationships with life and death. Those who survived often adopted new attitudes toward wealth, mortality, and society. Opportunistic shifts in labor, trade, and property ownership allowed survivors to rebuild with a sense of agency previously unavailable to them. Even the youngest generations inherited a world transformed by tragedy, yet defined by resilience and adaptability. Ultimately, the Black Plague is a story of both horror and endurance. Its lessons extend beyond history books, reminding us of humanity's vulnerability and our capacity to adapt, innovate, and persevere. The plague reshaped not just the physical world, but the social, economic, and cultural fabric of Europe, leaving a legacy that still resonates today. From the ashes of devastation rose a society more aware of mortality, more willing to challenge old hierarchies, and more resilient in the face of crisis. History may remember the Black Plague as a period of unimaginable suffering, but it also stands as a testament to human survival, adaptation, and the enduring strength of communities that refuse to succumb to despair.